Hi there. Thanks for joining us today at Scottish Summit 2024. My name is Marcel Lupo, and I'm today going to talk about how we can use Azure AI and OpenAI in Azure to transform DevOps, and how we can use Azure AI Studio to solve a few problems that I think is quite important to address. So I'll just quickly jump into the next slide here to say thank you to the sponsors of the Scottish Summit, some of the online streaming sponsors here. Thank you very much for making this happen, and also for the invite for this talk today. So like I said, my name's Marcel. I'm a dual category MVP in developer technologies, mainly DevOps, developer tooling, developer security areas, and also Azure, predominantly around infrastructure as code and solutions architecture. I've been working in I would say, computing or tech for over 20 years. I guess 20 years ago, DevOps wasn't called DevOps, but I've been in the tech industry quite a long time now, and quite passionate about it, especially now in DevOps as well, where everything is all about automation and efficiency and repeatability and agile working, all the practices that go with it. Yeah, for me, the motto is a true leader is always led, and it's true. I mean, people learn from each other, and this is hopefully you will learn something from this demo that I'm going to show today. There is a link here to my LinkedIn and to my, I normally write posts on Dev2. So there's a Dev2 blog post link there. If you want to catch me on Twitter or check out my GitHub account with all my repositories and stuff that I'm working on. So as I said today, we're going to talk about how AI can be used to some people might be concerned about AI and some people might be excited about AI. So I'm wondering what you are thinking about, whether it's, in this new era of AI and the popular use of LLMs like ChatGPT and stuff. Some people are quite concerned, some people are excited. But here are some of the key things that I come across when I ask these people, or normally the general public, how they feel about it. So some of the concerns people have are interesting. Privacy issues, for example, breaches of privacy, how ethical it is, biases, ethical decisions, liability, accountability. If AI is creating a best-selling book, is it the person who worked with the AI, or is it the AI? It's like things like that, the ethical dilemmas of it. Workforce impact, or intellectual property, for example, copyright and ownership, transparency, trust, accuracy of understanding, the security risks. Maybe people can use AI as well for malicious, intentional misuse for bad intent or harmful intent, and also sustainability concerns, because it takes a lot of energy and power for the compute to build these large language models, and that's not very eco-friendly and green. But what are some of the things people are excited about? So healthcare, for example, healthcare advancements, breakthroughs in science, or quicker ways to solve problems, innovation for transportation, maybe like improved safety, automated vehicles, maybe things like that, where it can be used in those areas. You could also arguably say that the environmental impact could be improved by modeling maybe weather data to work out more improved sustainable practices, for example. That's also a good use, which contradicts sustainability concerns about actually building these large language models. So it's kind of like, it depends who you ask the question and how they see it and interpret it. some people use it as personal assistants. Maybe it's quick and easy to find recipe ideas or help with everyday tasks, things like that. Also, maybe for education. So if you're trying to learn something and you don't quite understand fully from the material that you have, you might use AI to kind of explain it a little bit better in a way that you can maybe understand it or grasp it better. So that more of a human sort of, it's not human, but like a more understandable way to potentially teach you. And then self-development as well, like, for example, guidance, personal feedback, things like that. So this kind of brings me, to these concerns and that people have. Some people are excited and concerned, but people at Microsoft, especially including at Microsoft, are actively addressing a lot of the concerns developed by when it comes to AI and the usage of it by ethical practices, developing ethical guidelines and improving transparency and investing in sustainable practices. So people are working quite hard on these concerns that people might have. And it's getting there, I think. So this brings me more towards my demo and the talk that I'm going to talk about of how does this work? How does this kind of the issues I see in DevOps, for example, and how this can be addressed in an interesting way. So a bit more about the talk and demo that I'm going to show you is how Azure AI and LLMs can be used to enhance DevOps, DevSecOps, and infrastructure as code, because I work mainly with infrastructure as code and automation, and how it can actually be used to improve user experiences, integrating bespoke document, by integrating it or targeting the LLM against documentation that is private, not public, but privately held documentation, for example. Guidelines, processes, demonstrating how the LLMs can use this data to accelerate DevOps and infrastructure as code practices, not just for consumers of infrastructure as code, but also people who don't quite understand it. Maybe there's a new person that starts in a company. They don't really know, they know DevOps, they know infrastructure as code, but they don't really know the guidelines, the security practices, the naming conventions, all of these things that companies maybe have from when they started using these technologies, for example. I'll go a little bit deeper more into the use cases for this. And then, so the demo is basically based off a fictional company called Contoso, and it showcases how custom developed code, like in our case, Terraform, using infrastructure as code and GitHub Actions that are bespokely developed with the security best practices, naming convention, kind of coded into the code base. So it's quite a unique bespoke code base or documentation set that the DevOps team is using in Contoso. And they want to develop more infrastructure as code blueprints for their consumers to use. But they use a specific coding style. They use a specific naming convention. They use specific security practice in their company. For example, no infrastructure should be built publicly. For example, it should all be private and on internal networks. It should have a specific naming convention. Maybe they only want to build certain things and not allow other things. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to use Azure AI Studio and show how we can kind of put all of this together so that users can basically create an assistant and ask this assistant questions about the code base. And also, even though this demo that I'm going to show is kind of highlighted with techniques that are applicable to, the techniques that are applied here can be applied to almost anything, to be honest. And let me just go to the next slide. So the critical concerns for me when it comes to infrastructure as code is things like privacy, privacy issues, for example, security risks. sorry about that. Because Contoso has got a privately developed. Imagine you have an application or a software application that is privately developed. Using an LLM against public data is not going to, it might infringe copyright or your licensing. There are security risks. Maybe that code doesn't have best practices where your code base would have those practices built in. Maybe there are certain names or naming that is secret that you don't want to tell the public, things like that. So it kind of, by using LLM on private data, you can kind of almost mitigate certain security risks, ownership, liability, intellectual property, things like that. But also the practice itself. Like I said, at Contoso, people are writing in a very unique style, coding style. And we'll look at that in just a sec. So the demo also basically emphasizes on how the security best practices and guiding the use of private personal data by using that data in bespoke infrastructure as code solutions. So what you'll learn from this talk and demo is basically that we'll see how we can get started with Azure AI Studio. How you can get your own data in there. Specifically, in my case, it's going to be infrastructure as code, like Terraform modules, documentation, markdown file documentation, things like that. How to create an AI assistant to interpret and explain maybe modules and documentations. Using AI to interpret that as well, and basically the DevOps practices against that bespoke data, so you can ask it questions about the DevOps practice, for example, or the GitHub Actions, or how to use the GitHub Actions in the context of Contoso, and also how to use the AI to boost developers and DevOps and site reliability engineers' productivity, and to also streamline processes. What I mean by that is, for example, you might have a person join the team to write bespoke infrastructure as code, or maybe DevOps, but they might not, like I said earlier, be used to the company's guidelines or strategy. Their DevOps strategy might be different. Their tooling might be different. Their processes of deployment might be different. There might be different security things that they need to think about at a previous place where they didn't have, for example. It's interesting because even if you have a lot of documentation on your product or your application or infrastructure as code, you can sometimes get lost in the documentation. And there could be like 100 pages of documentation, for example, and it would take you time to read and fully understand that documentation. But if you could leverage the use of an LLM or an AI assistant to learn this document, or take this documentation, and you can ask it specific questions saying, actually, I don't know what is the naming convention. What is the naming convention here? And it would interpret that question and be able to give you an exact, precise, quick answer without you having to read 100 pages of documentation. Maybe you get lost in this documentation, for example, and that takes time, and you lose efficiency, or it becomes the process for you to learn or to know that becomes a longer process, where the AI can actually reduce that in a very short space. So it also not just helps people who want to learn, understand, and use the infrastructure as code or documentation effectively, but you can also actually ask it to give you maybe examples, and it would basically because it only knows the documentation that it's been given. It only knows those patterns, for example, so it could intuitively create new examples based on bespoke patterns and coding styles, for example. Say, for example, you have 25 Terraform modules that are all written in the same way, same format, same standard, and you want to introduce another module, you could, if the AI, if the LLM is trained on the data of the 25 modules that it exists, you could ask it to generate you an example of a new resource, and it would most likely intuitively know how it's written based on the pattern and coding style. And this is what we're going to look at in this demo. So basically, empowering the use of AI will basically empower DevOps using your data to streamline workflows, enhance security, and drive innovation. And I will just quickly jump straight into the demo here just to show you what I have done here. So I have here that fictional company called Contoso, and they have a wiki here, basically for, actually I have a GitHub Docs site based on this fictional company. And in this fictional company, Contoso is allowing their users to build their own infrastructure. So they're allowing their developers to kind of build their own infrastructure, and they have bespoke modules. For example, they have how to build a resource group, an API management gateway, application gateway, key vault, etc., etc. So they also have documentation on GitHub's best practices. So, for example, how does Contoso, what's the guidelines for deploying Terraform in Contoso? For example, you would need to have these prerequisites. For example, you need to have a resource group, you need to have all of these different things. There is a specific way how you can basically set up your CI/CD pipeline, because Contoso have their own GitHub Actions they wrote, so they have unique inputs only relevant to them, and they want people to use these GitHub Actions to deploy their modules, because these actions have got all the security things built into them. But obviously, you would need to read all of this documentation to get started, first of all. And then maybe what's Contoso's best practices for having secure code. For example, secret scanning should be enabled. Dependencies should be checked for vulnerabilities. Code scanning should be enabled. So there are, some guidelines that Contoso gives to their DevOps engineers. What is repository best practices? Maybe, for example, learning what is Contoso's best practices for using repos and projects. How can people contribute to modules if they maybe see a feature that's not there and they want to add a feature? Like, is there a contribution, a way to contributing in a certain way? Do you need to make a pull request? Do you make a fork? Or how does it work at Contoso? It's not a public GitHub project. It's all private and internal, so it might be completely different. And then things like, what are the best practices for writing infrastructure as code? Like, for example, using complex variable types, or how would variable validation work, or things like understanding the difference between count and for each, and when it's better to use one or the other. So a lot of tips and tricks, for example, if you're developing infrastructure as code. And then also, I've also added an additional resource. For example, what are the best practices for Azure naming rules and restrictions? For example, when you're building certain things in Azure, they would have certain, for example, character limitations or character limitations. Otherwise, the resource will not deploy. And if you don't adhere to those kind of rules, your deployment might fail. But again, for you to go and read this or look this up, and it takes time to go and look up all of this documentation, read it, and to fully actually understand it could take a little bit of time. So if we just have a quick look here, what I've done then, so what I've basically going to show is how can we take all of this information. Let me just quickly show you one more example. But what we'll do is we'll take all of this information and then feed it into a privately held using Azure AI Studio to kind of use that data for it, and then create a model or a large language model that we will then use against this data only. We'll create some indexes using cognitive services of Azure or Azure AI Search to basically index it and add vectors and make it much richer experience. And we will go through all of that. But just an example of what we're going to do is we're going to teach or create the AI system to use this data and then ask it some questions. Okay, so let me just start off with that first. So I've got here a resource group. So we'll basically start off with Azure AI Studio Hub. And I've already pre-built some of this stuff, but I will go through the different areas and what you should do or what you can do. So if we just look at the GitHub repository, say for example, where all the modules are, and this site basically, you'll see that it's all the documentation is actually markdown files. So for example, the modules, the guidelines for how to set up the CI/CD processes, how all bespoke documentation for Contoso. So say for example, when we want to build a key vault, you can see here that the documentation for key vault, if I just jump to the wiki page here, is you have an overview. You can learn more about Key Vault by navigating to the Microsoft Azure site about Key Vault. And this module, like I said, is a bespoke module that Contoso has written, and each module is versioned. And so, for example, why this is not just the Key Vault is you might have diagnostics added to it. You might have private endpoints added to it. You might have the log analytics tied into it because you want to monitor certain things. It's not just the Key Vault. With it comes either things that you need like prereqs, like built before, or build together with this resource if you want to use it. But you can't, because at Contoso, for example, they do not allow building a public Key Vault with any public access. It has to have a private endpoint or a service endpoint, for example, networking, VNet integration. So this module is specifically tailored based on that. And it also gives you the different versions because maybe the first release didn't have all the features that was needed. Maybe dependencies were updated in this version. So there's also versioned documentation, or at least versions of these modules. And you can see what is deployed as part of the module. What are the prereqs? What would you need? You would need a resource group or a virtual network. Log analytics is optional, but you will definitely need these too, because like I said, Contoso doesn't build anything publicly. They have to have it on a private network. They also have a unique, for example, naming convention. So which is based off maybe an environment and a project. So when the module is structured, you might not, because when people are building infrastructure as code, they can just give a resource any name. But at Contoso, to keep things consistent and across all projects and modules, all projects and resources in Azure, developers or people, consumers who's using this code might not need, they won't need to give a name. All they would maybe need to do is give some required inputs, like what's the network resource group, what is the private endpoint subnet where the resource will be attached to, and then you'll see here like what is the project name, and for example, what's the environment. And based off these inputs that gets given, Contoso's got a naming construct of that. So if your environment was dev, QA, UAT, testing, whatever, it would dynamically change this to this resource name to Conto dev. And the project, say the project was called PRJ, your name, the naming convention would be basically that. So this gives us more an idea of this is a very bespoke module, and you'll see also here that the way that it's called is using very specific repos in Contoso. So they're not like even public repos. It gives examples of variables, variable values. So it gives you, the documentation is quite good on how to start. What are the inputs, what the inputs mean, the type that they are. And like I said, this module is going to be very unique. For example, public network access is, I've put this example in here. But for example, the public network access is disabled by default because Contoso, like I said, wants only private key vault, for example. Now, what I see a lot of people do sometimes with LLMs is they will maybe ask ChatGPT or a public LLM to write them a key vault, for example, or a module to deploy key vault. And that's all good and well, because most public LLMs, let me just quickly jump here to the Terraform docs, the public docs, that is. Just quickly jump into there. Because I had this interesting question once where someone said, why can't I just use the LLM against public data that's already out there? So here's a good example for you. If you're going to use an LLM that's trained on this data, first of all, you won't have the naming convention that Contoso uses. You won't have the deployment strategy, the coding style, things like that, the naming construct. So for example, it would learn like public, I'll just quickly search for that, public access. Maybe it's not this one. Let's maybe take an API. So you'll see here that public network access enabled by default is true for building an API management. Now, if we look, that is, you can do that. And most likely, if you ask an LLM, can you build me an application gateway? It's not going to understand the context fully. It might just build a very basic application gateway with network access enabled. For example, in Contoso's case, if we look at application management module, the option for public access is not even there. So there is no actually an option built into this module to allow that, because you have to have a public, internal to Contoso with their naming convention and standards and stuff. And the response was that I got to that question was, but with very clever prompt engineering, you could get the same result. So if you can use a prompt to say to the AI very specifically and precisely your use case, which is, comes back to prompt engineering, you can get to the same result. But for me, this is an issue because it's not a huge issue, but if, for example, a person starts in a new company, or maybe they're a junior, maybe they're not a solutions architect, or maybe they don't even know what a private endpoint is. The issue becomes if the person does not actually know the context to ask in the prompt, they won't get to that result. So you're kind of almost expecting the person to use the AI to kind of intricately understand the resource. And there are many bolts and nuts and gears in many resources that get, and especially in Azure, things get developed and changed all the time, continuously. So something new might come out that even a solutions architect might not know about yet. But it might be crucial or critical to the security of that resource. Now, if you don't ask it the prompt exactly about that, it might not know about it. It might also not be trained on that yet. Public data is only trained up until a certain date. For example, I got another question once in this talk to say, what about, like, I asked the public ChatGPT and the features wasn't there. It's because the LLM was trained up to a certain date. So using LLMs more to interpret your own data is, for me, better. And also, you can also avoid things like, for example, say Contoso doesn't allow to build batch accounts because they're super expensive, or virtual machines maybe of a certain size. Because that is not in the documentation, like if we see here in Contoso's, in this case, we only have 5 modules, so we can't build batch or super big VMs. That's going to cost a lot. So if you would ask the LLM, the OpenAI, can you build a virtual machine? It would just say, I don't have that data, because it only knows this data specifically. So let's have a look at how we can achieve this and show some examples of that. So like I said, all the documentation, and this also comes down to another thing. The more data you have of your own data, the better the experience will be. So the more you can give it, the better your result will be. So for example, like I said, naming conventions, documentation, examples of that, code examples, explanation, like having a very rich set of documentation in this case is a good thing. I guess before AI and LLMs, it wasn't such a good thing because people would need to read hundreds of pages of documents to kind of understand, and they could lose themselves in the documentation, or maybe spend a day or two just finding something small. But in this case, we can give it a lot of good information and then utilize that use AI to utilize that to our benefit. So all I've done basically is I've taken all of these markdown files, all of the modules, all of the code in Azure. So for example, if I go into Azure AI Studio here, you'll see here that I've got 2 projects. You can create multiple projects for different things. But this is my private demo here. And you can pre-build some of these resources, or you can, when you're in AI Studio, you can set them up in AI Studio, which will build the resources that you need. But so for example, if you're adding your data, so I've added the storage account to put these files in. And then I've also got an index, which I created to, which I'll show in a sec, which I used Azure AI search with. And you can see here the indexes. The deployments I'll come to in a minute. The deployment component is basically which large language model you want to use. So for example, GPT-4, GPT-4o, text embedding others to basically vectorize your data to make it more intelligent, better answers, more consistent. I would always recommend vectorizing data using AI search. It just adds a lot more intelligence. But yeah, you could basically use the GPT-3, GPT-4. There are so many. For example, if we look at some of the models here available, there are quite a lot. There's the OpenAI ones, there's Microsoft ones, there's Meta ones. There's quite a lot. I mean, the popular ones are the OpenAI, which I've used here. And you can also tweak your models. So, for example, when you go into these models, you can basically tweak them based on, whoops, sorry, if I just quickly go in here, deployments. I edit this deployment. I could basically limit my tokens, my token rate. I can add a content filter, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I can also pick which version of the model I want to use. And I can also deploy new ones. Just to show you, if you were to deploy these things manually, if I go back to the resource group, you'll see here's my hub. The projects are as the same icon. And then you'll see here, this is my storage account. The key vault gets created automatically, and it kind of ties everything together. And I'll show that as well in a sec. And this is my Azure OpenAI, where I have all my models deployed. And I can deploy extra ones or take ones away, things like that. And here is the AI search service where I can index my data. So before jumping back into here, what I've done, and you can do all of this through Azure AI Studio also, but I quite like to go into these things separately and see what things they have to offer. But for example, how these things are connected to each other. So if we look at the settings, for example, you'll see these connected services. And these connected services like the AI search, the OpenAI service, the storage account, these connections are all interconnected. Like, for example, if your project needs to fetch data from or send requests to OpenAI, for example, the Azure OpenAI, it would need to connect to that resource through an API key and stuff like that. And these connections are actually simply just kept in this key vault. So when you're setting stuff up and you're starting to create things like storage accounts, connection, you create all these connectors, what's actually happening is these connectors are set up as secrets in the key vault. So for example, the storage account key to go and get the data, the API key for OpenAI. And so it's basically just, and if you remove resources, I don't think it clears up the secrets in the vault, but it is something that's being worked on. But so, for example, if you take away a storage account, it would remove the storage account, but it wouldn't remove the old connection, the old secret in there. But I mean, these are like very minor things that gets improved over time. So basically, what I've done in the case of Contoso is I've created a container with all of that documentation. So all of the modules, all of the GitHub best practices. So like I said, for example, when you want to use Contoso's Terraform modules, you have to set up GitHub Actions or GitHub workflows in a very specific way. So for example, if we look at the deployment guidelines here, you'll see here is an area or a topic where how to create your GitHub workflow using, you have to give it the path of where the module's kept. You need to give it a variables file. You need to give it lots of different inputs, basically, to use. And Contoso don't allow any other GitHub actions. They only allow their own. So you have to use this and kind of learn to know how it works, rather than asking a public, because that GitHub action might not be a public data. So just coming back into the storage account. So I've got all of these documents set up now. The next thing I did, or that I would do, is go to the Azure AI search or the cognitive service, because I want to create an index. I want to take all of that data and make it like vectorize it and create an index on that. So what I've done here, for example, in AI search, is I've imported and vectorized data. And before you could actually start vectorizing the data, you do need a model deployment, and that model deployment is at the moment, I think you get text embedding ADA 2. I think ADA 3 is also available in certain regions now. But the vectorization can use this, for example, model. So what we would do is we would import our data. So you'll see here my data source here is that blob storage account. And it just reads all the data that's in there. And then I have an indexer, which is it's basically I can create a schedule on this. I can create a scheduler to say. So as you know, like some documentation will change over time. So maybe the documentation that's in the storage account over a year becomes out of date. Maybe some modules get decommissioned or does not get used anymore, or something changes security-wise. The data can then be pushed to the storage account as it changes, and the indexer can basically dynamically update the documentation, and then create the index as well that we need for our data, the vectorized index. And like I said, I used for that the vector profile here is using it's using that ADA model, text embedding. You'll see here. So that's using my text embedding model to kind of vectorize the data. So I've got my index, I've got my data in my storage account, I've got my models deployed. Now I've created my index, and I can add all of these things in here in my project. My models are here, my index is here, my data is here. Now, content filters is an interesting one, because you can apply content filters to protect your data. So, for example, you can create like block lists. We'll just give it some. We'll just call this a custom filter. And then what you can do is you could set certain categories. So, like for example, violence threshold. Allow or block, or say we don't want to allow anything violent. No hate. No section. So you can have these kind of filters. You can also have media and text. You can kind of set these content filters up. Block list is also coming is in preview. You can also do this with your outputs, and then also to which models you want to apply that content filter against. Your OpenAI is your OpenAI module that is basically the LLM, and then you can use these things in combination and kind of almost protect your data, and quite good, this feature, the content filtering and block lists. So just going to let's go to the chat playground now. And it's interesting because like I said earlier, you can do a lot with prompt engineering as well. And Contoso actually has a section on their documentation which says, how can you talk to the AI? So maybe Contoso is also providing you this AI assistant for this kind of, I guess, documentation or the DevOps of their DevOps practice. So we can have a look here at certain prompts. And when I mean prompt, I mean how to give it a contextual understanding or prompt context, basically. So, for example, if it's a relevance and accuracy, you can ask the AI to pretend it to be in the context of needing, to help understand specific needs and goals, ensuring that it's relevant and accurate. For example, the DevOps, you can say you're a DevOps practitioner using Azure and Terraform. Or, for example, let's have a look here at ones that I've created here. So you could say, as a DevOps engineer and developer, you're creating AI application aimed at a technical audience, including those who are learning about infrastructure as code, and your focus is providing exceptional knowledge specifically to Microsoft Azure, because maybe Contoso is only using Azure, they're not using the other cloud providers, and also using Terraform for infrastructure code. But like I said, this could be Bicep, this could be ARM, this could be any language really, infrastructure as code language. GitHub and GitHub Actions also covering general practice for beginners, to offer insights, practical guidance of how to set up and manage infrastructure using CI/CD and ensuring security and compliance with collaboration and continuous improvement. So that's one example. You can have many of these different examples, or you can have more specific examples. For example, you're a DevOps engineer, or you're an automation engineer, or you're collaborating to a project of existing code, or you're following a certain strategy, maybe of Contoso as a DevOps engineer, or you just want best practice. So you can have more specific context examples. So I'm just going to take this first one here that I've created. And here in the chat playground, and you can deploy this into a web app. I'm not going to do this in this demo just because I'm aware of the time, but you could actually go and deploy this as a web application that people can go into. That is a normal, I guess, ChatGPT style experience. But just for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to show you here in the chat playground. So in the chat playground, we've got a few things that we can do. The first thing we'll do is, remember that index that we have is unique to our code base. It's not public, it's very unique to our internal code base. And this is also private in Azure. So it's not like anything's public here, or data leak is being leaked or anything. But I can pick my model now. I want to say I want to use GPT-4. Here is where you give the model instruction or context, and that's why I was talking about that prompt context. So for example, I'm going to put that in here that I copied from here, the prompt example, or the context in our case. And I'm going to use that model, and then I'm going to add my data. Now the data I want to add is that index, that vectorized index that I created with Azure AI Studio. I'm just going to add that. That should take a moment. And I can say, what sort of, what kind of thing do I want to use here? I'm just going to use a hybrid of vector or keyword. And I can give it some parameters, like, for example, how many messages do I want to include for the history? So let's say 20. Maximum response, I want as many, because my model is tuned to use a large token scale. Temperature, I maybe want to use a little bit less. I want it to be a little bit more, and my top P, frequent penalties. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that. So now I'm just going to apply these changes here. Okay, and that should now be updated with my things. Now, so for example, I wanted to deploy a key vault, but I didn't really know how I could say, how can I deploy a key vault in Contoso? I can ask it maybe this question. And it will now interpret that from that documentation code base that we've given it. And this is a little bit slow. I do apologize, because it's maybe a bit busy here. So for example, you said to deploy Key Vault in Contoso using Terraform, you can use the general steps extracted from the provided documents, and it gives you. I'll just let this finish loading because it's just. I'll give that a little bit of time here, just to get that. And you'll see here that the prerequisites is I need a minimum version of Terraform 1.8 or higher. I need the Azure IAM provider, the Azure ID provider. I need to create a configuration file. It tells me how to call that module and adjust the source based on maybe the version. And then I can basically deploy that. And it also says here that I can optionally deploy Log Analytics Workspace. And it actually gives you the references of where it found this information. So if we click on that, for example, it will jump straight to the relevant document for Key Vault on the prereqs, for example. And I can see here something about a naming convention also. So if I go now and look at maybe the second one, I can see, oh, here, okay, it's the overview, and here are the different versions, and this is what gets deployed, and more prereqs. Now, I can ask it another question and say, I know that the name of my key vault will be based on a naming convention, but I couldn't see. I'm going to just say what parameters are available for the key vault to use. And it will, like the inputs, for example, the input parameters or the variables that I can give this module. And that should come up in just a sec. And a little bit slow at the moment. Yes, when doing live demos. Let's give that a little bit of time there. What I will do, because I want to just talk about a different topic also while that's running. So here we go. So that's now said to me, these inputs are required, meaning I have to give them. I don't have a choice. And you can see here, again, it specifies that you have to have a VNet, a subnet, because we're going to use private endpoints, what the virtual network is of where the subnet is, and the resource group name. So these are optional things that I can add extra. So I can add, for example, I can't see anywhere where I can put a name, but I can see here that I've got an environment, and also, so I can ask it, how can I know what is the name of my key vault? Because I couldn't see an input to give it a name. So while that's running, I just want to quickly jump back into the data sources. Remember, I said you can have your data sources, a storage account with files in them. I just wanted to show you some of the other options available. You can use, if we look here, you could use blob storage, data lake, or OneLake. So you could get data from these sources. It's not just like storage accounts, and there'll be more that come, I'm sure. With indexing, so for example, if I wanted to add a new indexer, I'm using an existing one, which is Azure AI Search, or I could create a new one if I needed to, or from blob storage, or from storage URL, or by uploading files. Now, I basically manually uploaded my files and created manually the AI search and created the index of that. You don't have to do that. You can do all of that through Azure AI Studio. So for example, I using my existing one that I have, and then I could say I want to use that specific one, and I want to create a search index. And you can do all of those settings through here as well, more in a guided way, more in a guided fashion. And again, the same with deployments. If I didn't want to use GPT-4, for example, I could use deploy a new base model, and I could say I want to use, for example, GPT-3.5 Turbo instead, and I can confirm that, and it will build that, and then I can tweak it based on capacity and fine tuning and stuff like that. So you can build all of those things here, and I just wanted to show basically that the sources of your data is not limited to just a storage account. There are other ways to source your data into this. So you can see here that the question I asked was, I didn't quite understand that question. That's okay. So what it's probably thought, how can I get the name of my key vault after it's been created? So I can say, because I know that my naming convention needs, if I look at the previous inputs here, I can see here that for example, the environment specifies the environment, and where was it? I can't actually see the other one now. Okay, I didn't take that. I'm not sure. Maybe that's not in the documentation, but let's see if I said if my project is called Ryan and my environment is dev, what would be the name of my key vault? Because after I build my key vault, I might not know what it's called, so I might not find it. There might be many subscriptions and many resource groups and many key vaults in the company. So using a module like this to deploy my own key vault, I might have it might be quite a task to find what it's called. So based on that data, I can say, okay, so based on the naming convention provided for a document by the Contoso key vault documentation, key vault will be constructed using environment and project name and a key vault number. So it's just a little bit slow, sorry about that. And then you can also, okay, so here we go. So you can see here that it's taken my environment Dave, it's taken my project Orion. Because I didn't specify a key vault number, which I'm sure is an input, if we look here, key vault number, yeah, that's used in the naming convention, for example, 001, 002. And I didn't even specify that. So I just assumed that my key vault number would be 1, because it's the first one. It gives me a nice visual representation of which variables are used to construct that name. How I can use the TFRs file to kind of populate the data for that. And I can see, okay, this is what my key vault is going to be called. And then I can also reference that directly from the documentation, which is this naming convention part. Now, this to me is like a really interesting. So, for example, say I want to ask it one last question, and I'll end the demo here on this part. But say, for example, if I just quickly go to my documentation for a key vault, if I look here, you'll see here that I've got an example, and I've got some example inputs that I can use, and the variables, and how I can actually use this module fully. So, say for example, like I said earlier, my project is called Orion, and I don't want to look at that. I just want this to generate my example. So I'm going to say, can you show me an example usage of an example use? Can you show me a usage example of to build a, let's maybe try something different. Let me just see what we've got here. We have, for example, API management, API gateway, let's say, to build an API management, to build an Azure API management. If my project is called Orion, and my environment is testing, or maybe, I don't know, UAT. Can you also show me how I would deploy this using Contoso's GitHub Actions and the and an example of the CI/CD YAML workflow. Let's see what it comes up with that. And because it's quite it's kind of almost asking two different questions. One to show how to set up how to code the module, and then one how to set up the automation and CI/CD to deploy that module that you want to use for your project. So let's see what that comes back with, and then I'll basically stop at that point with the demo. So while this is running, I'm just going to quickly jump back or talk about, or just a recap on why this is important, at least in terms of working with DevOps and working with infrastructure as code. Because like I said earlier, if you're using a public LLM and just asking it a random question, set up for me a GitHub action or a CI/CD process, and you're not very specific with what you're asking, it could give you a process based on AWS maybe, or infrastructure in AWS, or it might use, if you use the context of DevSecOps, you might use different tooling. So for example, your tooling might be completely different in the company that you're working in. They might have very bespoke processes. Maybe they're using SonarQube, maybe. So training the data on your data, you can almost kind of safeguard the practice also, and not get like random teams doing random different things. And that's quite important, in how we can leverage this technology, or the LLMs nowadays, that can really help accelerate and almost be like a co-pilot, like a private little assistant or for your project. Another interesting use case that I'm working on just with AI at the moment, or with LLMs, is, for example, in this example, we gave it a lot of information, for example, documentation. Now, in the context of a DevOps engineer. But say, for example, you have some like I said earlier, Azure AI Studio here. To build any solution in Azure or a cloud, you need an architecture. You need certain things to fit in together, and that would be your architecture. If you're using Azure AI Studio, where I said you add your data, you add your indexes, it will automatically build the resources that it would need to support that solution, like any solution in Azure. Like if it's a web application, if it's this, if it's that, it doesn't matter. And it builds this ecosystem. So these resources forms the solution of Azure AI Studio. You could almost say that this is the architecture of the solution. Now, a really nice thing about Terraform is it produces Terraform plans. So for example, if I was to build Azure AI Studio using Terraform or Bicep, or I would need to code in, I want a search service, I want a storage account, I want a key vault. You would need to code all of that in your code. And that would generate a Terraform plan. And that plan is basically a JSON interpretation of what the infrastructure would look like when you build it, that you can go through. So another good use case for me of leveraging AI, because some Terraform plans can be pages and pages and pages of JSON. So you could actually leverage AI to take that Terraform plan, maybe as your part of your deployment process, push it to a storage account or an indexer that would index that data into your AI assistant. And you could say, can you tell me more about this plan? You know, is anything critical going to get destroyed? Like, is it going to destroy my SQL server? And why am I going to lose my data? And it would interpret that Terraform plan. So this is a use case, a good use case. Another use case that I'm thinking about is, what if you can visualize the plan? So as a solutions architect, you might go, actually, this is a huge plan. It's like 100 pages. I don't know how can I diagram that? And then you could maybe teach the LLM to interpret that plan to create you a diagram, for example, an architecture diagram. That's also another use case. Or maybe someone that does not understand the architecture. So say, for example, a solutions architect designs the solution, and in a year's time, the solution changes. Maybe they need something new. Maybe they need a data lake now instead of a storage account. The infrastructure changes, but the diagram and documentation won't change. But if you can take that Terraform plan each time you run it, now you're adding something, now you're removing something, and feed it into your indexer, your documentation, diagrams, or assistant will automatically get updated as the resources get updated. So you could almost create an assistant like a virtual solutions architect to say, can you explain for me the architecture of this application? Can you maybe can you make a diagram? And because the deployment mechanism of deploying this infrastructure is automated in DevOps in code, you can use that as part of your automation process to almost teach your AI or index your data regularly. And based on that data, you can have a virtual co-pilot that can then go, when you're running this Terraform plan, your diagram is changing like this, and it adds the extra storage account. Or be careful because it's going to destroy your SQL server. You might lose all your databases, things like that. So these are good use cases that I can also see how AI can really, really help. Because this also takes time if you're a DevOps engineer or an infrastructure as code engineer having to review Terraform plans that are hundreds of pages long, that could hamper the deployment or maybe a small change of a deployment. And you could really leverage AI in with these techniques. So just going back real quick to that question that I asked it, you can see here that it's given me an excellent example of how to create my resource. Sorry, not that, this one here. So I can create my resource. I can then, it also tells me how I can set up my Terraform plan. my Terraform CI/CD process. I can also ask it, what is the latest version? Oops, what is the latest version I can use? I was a bit vague on that, but maybe. But you can see here that it will reference the document. Sorry, it's a bit frozen now. Let's just let it finish generating that here. And you can see here that the latest version of Contoso's API module is version 3.1.3.1, for example, that added support for custom host names and improved logging features. And you can see here that it will go and get that information from here. And that concludes the demo, really, for how you can really transform DevOps, AI. Sorry, just going back here. Yeah, how you can leverage AI and Azure AI Studio to kind of teach it your own practices, documentation in terms of DevOps, GitHub, or security practice infrastructure as code specifically. But like I said, these techniques could be applied in almost any practice or any code base, I could say. You could say not just for helping people who write the code, like the engineers that's behind creating the code, but also for people non-technical who maybe wants to use the code, or maybe understand the code, or maybe a solutions architect wants to see, the output of a solution from the code. And yeah, so there are many different ways of application that you can use this in the realm of DevOps. And yeah, so once again, thank you very much. I think we ran a little bit with time, but thanks again to the sponsors for South Coast Summit for making this possible. And yeah, thank you very much for joining. And that concludes my talk for how you can transform DevOps with AI and some insights from Azure AI Studio. So thank you very much.